Hey everyone, this is Daniel Peta from the World Geopolitics channel, and in today's video we're going to look at this geopolitical reorientation of the United States, because it's no small thing, and very likely it's not just something about politics or Donald Trump's administration. It's probably a long-term trend we're seeing, so this is going to change the geopolitical equation on the planet a lot. We're seeing a change and a dispute among elites. On one side, there's a new technocratic elite, ironically wanting to embrace the origins of 19th century United States geopolitical orientation, and on the other side, an older, more traditionalist elite, but interestingly, one that has adopted a new post-1950 geopolitical orientation. In other words, it's a new elite embracing an old geopolitics and fighting against an old elite that has a relatively new geopolitics. This new one, right? After World War II, it became more guided by ideological factors and less by geopolitics, while this line, the new elite based on these technocrats, is embracing a purely geopolitical orientation. This is a big topic, but we'll cover it in detail in today's video. Remember to subscribe, check your subscription, and turn on notifications even though the bell rarely works. What do you think? But subscribe to support us and share the video with everyone you know to give us a hand, so that this channel, which is practically non-existent and nobody knows about, can keep existing and maybe, who knows, keep growing, alright? I'm Daniel Peta, and this is World Geopolitics. History shows that the United States gained a projection capability in decades that past empires couldn't achieve in centuries. I'm not referring to a global projection, since that requires current technology that wasn't available before. I'm referring to the level of power this nation holds over other nations it interacts with. The United States is a unique empire in many ways. They have a vast number of unique things that set them apart from empires of the past. And here I'm using the word empire. Some people use the term imperialists pejoratively to describe Americans, but in the sense that they are a great power that projects power and influence beyond their own borders. So they need an imperial calculation, even though a lot of things on their part in this imperial calculation are different from the old empires of the past. Still, a lot of things remain the same. One of those unique things they have is the speed with which they got to where they are and the timing. The reason for this was the British heritage. For the first time in history, an empire handed over its strategic advantages to another country, and this was not a mistake by London. It was a smart, pragmatic, and very realistic calculation, one that only someone with a banker's mindset could make. Basically, at the end of World War II, the English realized that it would be very difficult for them to maintain their empire as it was now. The world would be split between two giants, the Soviet Union in the east and the United States in the west. And this became even more evident in 1956, when the English and the French intervened in the Suez War after a conspiracy with Israel. The idea in that episode was that after Egypt had nationalized the canal, going against the interests of London and Paris, Israel would then attack the Egyptians, and then the French and the English would come in to save the day. And finally the violence, which as a result would then lead to the internationalization of the canal. The Parisian plan was good, but it was rather obvious that it was a scam. The Soviet Union quickly intervened, making it clear it wouldn't tolerate this and that the canal belonged to the Egyptians. And that if the French and the English did not withdraw, the Soviets would attack both countries. And what did the English and French do? They remembered that they had the powerful NATO on their side until the United States backed out, and said no, they would not support England and France. After all, not only were they the ones who created this mess, but NATO was a defensive organization, and they were the ones who attacked Egypt, so they should be the ones to deal with the consequences. And by the way, they also agreed with the Egyptians that the canal belonged to Egypt. So yes, it was a different time. After all, the United States, at the beginning of NATO, was really trying to sell the idea that NATO was defensive. A lot has changed since then, and NATO is no longer defensive, though many people without historical knowledge still claim it is. But anyway, the point there is that the British and the French realized that, on their own, they wouldn't be able to handle it, and backed out of Egypt with their tails between their legs. Some may call it cowardice that the United States didn't support fighting the Soviet Union, but that's not true. On several other occasions, the Americans challenged the Soviets. In fact, they even provoked the Soviets. Remember the 1949 Berlin blockade when Americans openly challenged Moscow and broke it. So, no, it's not like they were afraid of the Soviets. The point is that the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals. But pay close attention to this because a lot of people don't understand this when I talk about the Cold War. The two of them were engineers of a new world order, a bipolar order. And in this new order, there was no room for the old European imperialism, the one that subjugated peoples and controlled territories. Imperialism, of course, hadn't ended. It never really ended, but it renewed itself. Now it was about winning over hearts and minds. I've already said on the channel that since World War II, state borders have held a certain sanctity. The Soviet Union and the United States partnered to build this new global system. It's not that there was no room for the old European imperialism out of altruism or idealism, but because it became inefficient and unstable within the logic of the Cold War. The result was an explosion of independence movements in Africa and Asia, which would be co-opted by Moscow and Washington. So there was nothing left for the Europeans. And this is where something happened that would make all the difference in the future of the planet. France was proud and rushed to develop its atomic bomb so it would no longer depend on the United States umbrella. Just as they fought tooth and nail against the separatist movements in their former colonies, and they took a beating, they were humiliated. But the English then did two things, and these two things defined the world that existed until 2020. And pay close attention to this. The first is that they turned to the elites of their former colonies. And instead of fighting like the French did, uselessly, they turned to most of these countries. They said, "You want independence? Fine, no need to fight. Here you go, but now you must build a country from scratch. And you don't have money or experience, you also don't have skilled labor, you don't have industry, you have nothing. So how about instead of us fighting, I'll give you your independence and even lend you some money so you can build your infrastructure like ports, airports, and telecommunications. All I'm going to ask is that you keep trading with me, okay? How about if I even give you big scholarships for you to distribute among the children of your elite? So they can study here in England at our top universities? It sounded too good to be true. And what did most countries decide to say to the English? Yes. After all, independence without war, and on top of that with money to build a modern country from scratch. And all of this in exchange for just keeping trade with the English. Almost no one said no. They even created a bloc called the Commonwealth of Nations for this. In other words, instead of fighting with their former colonies, the English simply became their creditors. And since the elite of these countries would now be educated in England, they still had personal and strong connections with those who really held power in these countries, who were outside the government, in positions of permanent influence. It was a masterstroke by the English. But then we have the second thing. No matter how rich they are, no matter how many debtors they have, it doesn't matter if they don't have strong arms to intimidate those who owe them. Just like a loan shark, it's no use for the loan shark to lend money if he doesn't have a way to collect later, through threats. And that's when another huge thing happened in geopolitics. The English didn't fight to maintain their position as the top power, like the old empires did in the past. They saw that they wouldn't be able to keep that position by force, so they did what the pilot fish does with the shark. They hitched a ride with the biggest fish in that pond to feed on whatever was left over. If they could merge their interests with those of the United States, then they would be safe. And that's when the English, especially their banking elite, turned to the Americans and said, "Hey Washington, now you'll have to build a global power and compete with the Soviet Union for world leadership. So that's going to take time. How about instead of you creating this whole global mechanism of facilities, bases, contacts, everything around the world from scratch? How about using our pre-existing infrastructure? And guess what, United States? The best part is that we're not going to charge anything for it. We don't want anything in return. That's what the English did. They gave access to their military bases, their facilities, their maps, the elite contacts of these former colonies. They had co-opted and exchanged secret information between spy agencies. This saved the Americans a huge amount of work and time. It made their lives much easier. Because the Soviet Union had to build infrastructure from scratch in Central Asia while also rebuilding from World War II's devastation, and still create a network of contacts abroad. From nothing, the Americans got everything ready, everything handed to them. And if anyone challenged the English, they would end up, as a consequence, challenging American interests. So the English successfully managed to tie their interests to American interests. That seems like a logical thing to do nowadays. When you look back, it even seems predictable, but not seeing this from that time was unthinkable. No one would have imagined that this would happen. One thing that many people don't know is that the country that was seen as the main enemy of the United States, its main threat until the beginning of World War I, entering a kind of strange phase. During the interwar period, it wasn't Germany, it wasn't China, not even Japan, and not even the Soviet Union itself. The country that the United States saw as the main threat was the British Empire, and the American elite in Washington was certain of it. The English Empire, with its banks, institutions, and secret societies, and everything else you can imagine, was a real threat to the American way of life and the ideology of the United States. Notice that in the 1920s, the American armed forces had developed a plan called the Red War Plan. It was a detailed contingency plan for a war against the British Empire and aimed at an attack on Canada, which was British territory at the time. And that feeling wasn't an illusion. Not only did the United States gain independence from the English, so they would naturally have some distrust, but the only country that invaded the United States by land was the English in the War of 1812. By the way, they even set fire to the White House in the process. The White House that everyone knows today is actually the second White House. The Monroe Doctrine itself, which people talk so much about in relation to America, for Americans it was an anti-European stance, but actually it wasn't so much anti-European, it was also that. But the main priority was anti-British. It was about trying to keep the English away from the American continent. During the American Civil War, the English didn't support the Southern Confederates mainly because of slavery. The English political elite made it clear that without that reason, they would have blockaded Northern Union ports. So now Donald Trump is bringing back a modern and adapted version of that same American geopolitical strategy. And if you follow the mainstream media, you'll see that when they talk about Donald Trump, they say he's threatening alliances with his demands regarding Greenland, which is actually true. But more than that, Donald Trump is achieving what has always been seen as the original focus of American geopolitical thinking. And most importantly, he is putting an end to 80 years of British control over American foreign policy. Because that's what happened. NATO actually dragged the United States into defending British interests in Europe, even though Europe was never of interest to the United States. Two things were strong, very strong in the United States throughout the 20th century. The idea of free trade and the idea of capitalist competition. Big barons once monopolized the market. While frowned upon in the 19th century, it was viewed more favorably in the 20th century. However, these two things were gradually being restricted, decade after decade, after World War II, tying up the American economy more and more into cartels. One cartel is housing, the other is healthcare. But the most dangerous and influential one, which extended even beyond the United States manipulating America's inner workings, was the one President Eisenhower warned about, the industrial complex, because it would co-opt the entire United States deep state. President Trump demanded that the main defense contractors end their stock buyback programs and limit their salaries. He is demanding that they stop being financial institutions and go back to being industrial institutions, which was the economic message he presented in Davos. Now, the idea is to get rid of the financial parasites so that the real economy and American families can grow again. Just like it was after World War II, especially during the 1950s and 60s. Trump's actions regarding Greenland have nothing to do with territorial expansion in the literal and traditional sense. Many of the new American elites believe that the United States should focus only on what is in the United States' own interest. And many, and I mean really many of them, believe that ending NATO would be like getting rid of a tool of control that overrides American interests. Pulling the United States to defend European interests, more specifically British interests, outside the United States. In January 2025, I posted a video on this channel predicting everything we saw during the year. The United States prioritizing the Americas, the Arctic, and the Pacific, moving away from areas that are not of immediate interest. Washington, that even includes the Middle East. And this became clear in the American intervention in Iran, when after days of remote fighting between Israelis and Iranians, the United States attacked Iran's strategic nuclear facilities. But only because, now that some time has passed, we know the Americans didn't want to get involved there. They only did this after Netanyahu made it clear that either the United States would step in to support Israel or they would use nuclear weapons against Iran. This was unclear at first, but as time passed and people spoke out, it became clear about the United States. Trump didn't want to get involved with Iran, but he was pressured by Israel to prevent the situation from escalating even further. The blackmail succeeded for now, prompting American involvement to prevent a worse outcome. But it's very likely that soon, not even this kind of Israeli pressure. The United States will focus its geopolitical imperatives outward and will try to restructure itself internally. And the great irony of this, which few people are noticing, is that they will copy much of what China is doing in terms of geopolitical imperatives. The first thing that is a top priority for Americans is the Panama Canal. It's not a small thing. It gives Americans genuinely global reach. If they lose that, they've lost much of the reach they have today, so they need to protect that canal at all costs. Which, if you pay attention to the news, you'll remember happened last year. BlackRock went all in on Panama, pushing the Chinese out of control of the canal. Nothing is more important to Americans than the Panama Canal. Keep that in mind. And to guarantee Panamanian protection, they need to secure control of two areas. The first is the Caribbean subsystem. It is to the United States what the Mediterranean Sea is to Europe. That's why a hostile country like Venezuela, staying there, flirting with China and Russia about putting military installations inside, really worried Washington. That was tolerated for too long. While the United States prioritized NATO for ideological interests and as a consequence for the interests of England, they abandoned the Caribbean system for a long time. That was crucial for Panama's security, a geopolitical issue that will always take priority over ideology. The oil that many people talked about is just a bonus. I see a lot of people insisting that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And that's why the United States is so desperate to get Venezuelan oil. But what they don't understand is that the United States doesn't need to be desperate, because they have a huge amount of oil in their own territory, and Venezuelan oil is very thick, which means that refining it is expensive. And I say much more expensive than oil in other places, because not all oil is the same either. You need to keep that in mind. So if you can extract oil from Venezuela and make a profit from it, great. But that's not the main point for them to worry about. The concern is a country of this size that could host Russian and Chinese bases, and that could break through the control of the Eastern Caribbean islands, putting the Caribbean subsystem at risk and, as a consequence, the Panama Canal. The other is the Gulf of Mexico, like the Caribbean, but the issue here is Cuba. That's why we've seen ongoing threats against Cuba recently, not only from Trump, but also from Marco Rubio and other Washington elites. The Americans will likely take action against Cuba. The difference between Cuba and Venezuela is that Cuba has a much stronger and more consolidated institutional capacity than Venezuela. But make no mistake, if the United States wanted to take Cuba out of the game, they would have done it a long time ago, and now Cuba has been struggling for a long time. It will also be even easier now. It's quite likely that the Cuban elite, in order not to be overthrown by force, might even end up giving in to negotiations with the United States, which would be something huge and would confirm American interests in a new doctrine, Monroe. But regarding the Gulf issue I mentioned here, the Gulf of Mexico, besides access to the Panama Canal, there's another very important matter, which is the mouth of the Mississippi. Notice that from the Mississippi Delta, you have a continuous waterway from the south all the way to the Great Lakes in the north on the border with Canada, through which, via the St. Lawrence River, you reach the northern channel of the Atlantic, which, heading south along the east coast, then forms a big loop, the Great North American Loop. This river and ocean system is the largest continuous aquatic system on the planet. It is bigger than all the other systems combined. And this literally connects the productive base of the interior of the United States directly to global trade, without having to go too much overland. So, the Gulf of Mexico is essential in connecting this river-ocean system to Panama, which connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through the Caribbean subsystem. So they don't need the Suez Canal or to go around South Africa or the Strait of Magellan in southern Chile and Argentina. In fact, even the vital and extremely important Strait of Malacca isn't that important either, because for them, who have this bioceanic connection in their own backyard, linking their interior to all parts of the planet, they have a huge commercial advantage. That's why maintaining control over the Antilles and Caribbean islands is so vital, because it's literally an arc of islands that protects these two systems. The only potential threat, which never materialized but was possible, was Cuba and Venezuela. The only time this almost materialized into a real threat. But it became clear that they would do whatever it takes to defend the region. Now the other imperative is the Arctic, which they already have partial control over, thanks to Alaska. But there's this current obsession with Greenland, which isn't for nothing, because here we have the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom, which is this line between Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland. From here, the Americans are not only able to target all the naval trade from Northern Europe, but even that from Northern Russia. More importantly today, in the era of ballistic missiles, is Greenland along with Alaska. The United States is fully capable of monitoring the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, as well as striking any region in the northern hemisphere. The position of Greenland is absolutely vital for the geopolitics of the United States. If not Greenland, it would be Iceland, but Greenland is much cheaper economically and politically, so it's obvious that the rare earths. But that alone wouldn't be enough. It's the sum of all the factors that make the economic and political cost of such a big and risky move for the future of the United States worthwhile. So, this ambition in Greenland, combined with the pressure on Cuba and Venezuela, isolates the United States from any supposed future threat, whether from China or Russia. In other words, even a European resurgence, it doesn't matter. Above all, given their decline in power, which will no longer be as uncontested as it was in the past. So, it's a paradox, because the withdrawal of the United States will make the world a more chaotic place. That's true, but they were also at the limit of maintaining this global role. So, to avoid the collapse of an overstretched and costly system, they are pulling back. Anyway, it seems, at least for now, because if you ask me again in a year, next year, I don't know if I'll have to change my answer. The answer is that based on what's happening now and looking at the historical traditions of American geopolitics, it's yes. NATO is heading toward an end and Europeans will have to manage on their own in this new world. Well folks, that's it for today. It's clear that we're seeing a return to the original geopolitics of the United States, back to what it was in the 19th century. Focusing much more on the Western Hemisphere, which is the Americas, and turning toward the Pacific and the Arctic. In this sense, Europe ends up somewhat disoriented, because in just 4 years it was suddenly attacked by Russia and now faces aggression from the United States. We're witnessing something major, and even if the Trump administration changes, maybe it will. There are various ways to do this, but it seems this policy will persist. Ultimately, only time will tell. We see the traditional orientation and their doctrines, so it's not a prophecy. It's a probability that may increase over time until it materializes, and it may decrease over time. Until the moment it shows that things have been rearranged back to how they were before or into something new, let's wait. Anyway, it's an elite dispute that we are seeing in the United States, and that is repeating itself in several other countries around the world. It's something very big, and with a civilizational impact, it will have a huge impact on the future of humanity. Alright then everyone, that's it. Thank you very much. If you enjoy the channel, consider becoming a member to show your support. You'll get early access to these videos, exclusive channel videos, and direct participation in live streams. Interacting with me makes it easier to connect and have a back and forth. You keep the Geopolitical Mundial channel alive, because if it depended on views, it would have already shut down. So, by becoming a member, you make sure I stay here with you. Take care everyone, and see you in the next video.